There are houses that time forgets, and then there are houses that time tried very hard to erase, but somehow, against the logic of economics and the appetite of developers, failed. Falaise stands on a bluff above Long Island Sound, its Norman-style stone towers and arched windows facing the water as though waiting for ships that will never arrive. The name means cliff in French, and it suits the place, perched, precarious, beautiful in the way of things that probably shouldn't have survived. The walls are Indiana limestone and stucco, aged now to the color of old parchment. The formal rooms inside wood-paneled tapestry hung, still arranged with the furniture and objects a Guggenheim once chose, carry the particular silence of spaces that have outlived their original purpose. Outside, salt air moves to the hedges and across the terraces, indifferent to ownership, indifferent to legacy. This is not Biltmore with its vast acreage and endless endowment. It is not Mar-a-Lago, reborn as a private club. Falaise is smaller, quieter, more fragile, and yet it endures. A medieval-looking fantasy built with industrial money, now marooned in a modern world that rarely tolerates such footprints. The Gold Coast of Long Island, once thick with estates like this, shed most of them decades ago razed for subdivisions or taxes or simple exhaustion. Falaise came within a breath of the same fate. That it stands at all is less a triumph than reprieve. The Guggenheim name carries weight. It conjures images of spiral-ramped museums, of modern art and European elegance, of a family that shaped American cultural life with the same industrial fortune that built railroads and mines. But names, however gilded, do not pay heating bills. They do not cover insurance or staff or the quiet rot that begins in the walls of even the finest houses when the money that built them begins to splinter. This is the story of Falaise, but it is also the story of what happens when vision meets volatility, when a family famed for brilliance and taste is shadowed by loss that becomes, in the public imagination, something darker. 3 generations of Guggenheims touched this house. Some lived here in genuine splendor, others barely visited, but nearly all were marked by tragedy deaths that came too young, too sudden, too strange to ignore. Divorce, accident, scandal, and suicide wove through the family tree with a rhythm that gossip columns could not resist and that even admirers found difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Was there really a curse? Some metaphysical price exacted for wealth accumulated in copper mines and smelters? Or was it simply the predictable cost of living at the edge of excess fast planes, fast boats, marriages strained by fortune and fame, children raised in the shadow of a name too large to escape? The question sounds like melodrama, but melodrama has a way of clinging to houses like this, especially when the facts accommodate it. And there is another question, quieter but no less urgent. What does it take financially, emotionally, institutionally to keep a great house alive after the fortune that built it is gone? After the heirs have scattered or spent or simply lost interest? Falaise survived, but survival is not the same as thriving. It required negotiation, donation, decades of uncertainty, and the kind of compromise that old money families often find harder than demolition. This is not a story of villains or saints. It is a story of ambition and fragility, of a house that was built to look eternal and then had to fight, decade after decade, to remain standing. The contrast is everywhere. Storybook beauty framed by the constant threat of decay. An iconic name tethered to an estate that nearly vanished into memory. Falaise is still here, but the question is not just how it survived, it is why, and at what cost, and what it can teach us about the arithmetic of legacy when the numbers no longer add up. Every great house has a foundation story, but not all of them begin in lace-curtain comfort or with land grants from kings. The Guggenheim fortune, the money that would eventually build Falaise and endow museums and collect Renaissance tapestries, began with a Jewish immigrant from Switzerland who arrived in Philadelphia in 1847 with modest ambitions and no particular vision of dynasty. Meyer Guggenheim was 19 years old. He spoke German and Yiddish, some French, and halting English. His first ventures were small, peddling household goods, later manufacturing stove polish and lye, trading in imported embroidery. Respectable work, but hardly the machinery of an empire. What changed was copper. In the 1880s, Meyer invested in 2 silver mines in Leadville, Colorado, a speculative gamble born less from expertise than from opportunity and the willingness to risk capital most immigrants of his generation never accumulated. The mines produced not just silver but lead and copper, the latter increasingly valuable as America electrified. Meyer saw what others were slower to understand, The real money was not in digging ore from the ground, but in controlling what happened to it afterward. Smelting, refining, transportation. He began acquiring the infrastructure piece by piece, building a vertical empire that stretched from mineshaft to market. By the 1890s, the Guggenheims dominated American copper production. Meyer and his 7 sons there were also daughters, but the business was not built to include them. Operated mines in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and later Mexico and Chile. They built smelters that processed ore cheaper and faster than competitors. They negotiated with railroads, undercut rivals, and played the global commodities market with an aggression that made them both wealthy and resented. This was the Gilded Age at full throttle, an economy that made room for vast fortunes through consolidation, mechanization, and a willingness to operate at scales that required not just capital but nerve. The Guggenheims were not Vanderbilts or Astors, families whose money had had time to soften into respectability. They were new rich, and it showed not in vulgarity, but in velocity. The fortune came fast, and it carried with it all the hungers and anxieties of speed. Meyer ran the family like a firm. His sons were expected to work, to prove themselves, to carry the name forward not as ornament, but as obligation. Daniel, the eldest and most capable, became the public face of the business. Murray, Solomon, Benjamin, Simon, William, and Isaac each took roles, some more willingly than others. The structure was patriarchal and unforgiving. Loyalty was assumed, failure was not discussed, only corrected. There was wealth, yes, but wealth yoked to performance, to the constant pressure of maintaining what had been built and expanding it further. The family presented a united front to the world, but unity under pressure is not the same as harmony. Fortunes built quickly carry their own volatility. Copper prices fluctuated. Labor strikes threatened production. Competitors schemed. And within the family, ambitions sometimes diverged. Some sons wanted to prove they could succeed independent of the family name. Others chafed under Daniel's leadership. A few, as they grew older and richer, began to wonder whether there might be more to life than smelting tonnage and profit margins. Public opinion was less admiring than the fortune might have predicted. To many Americans in the early 20th century, men like the Guggenheims were not titans but trusts, monopolists who extracted wealth from the earth and the labor of others, who played by rules they themselves had written. There were congressional investigations, accusations of exploitation, the faint but persistent stain of suspicion that accompanies industrial fortunes. The Guggenheims were respected, even feared, but not universally loved. This is the foundation beneath Falaise, and beneath the museums and the philanthropy and the art collections that came later. Not a legacy handed down through generations of landed gentry, but a fortune assembled in a single lifetime by a man who arrived with nothing and built an empire through calculation and will. The romanticism of old money is a trick of time and good tailoring. Scratch the surface of almost any American dynasty and you find not aristocrats but immigrants, not leisure but relentless work, not ease but the grinding arithmetic of ambition. Meyer Guggenheim died in 1905, wealthy beyond measure and largely unknown outside business circles. His sons inherited not just money, but the expectation that they would do something significant with it, something that justified the weight of the name. Some would build museums, some would collect art, and one in particular would build a castle on a cliff as though to prove that new money, given enough time and taste, could outlast the machinery that made it. By the first decade of the 20th century, the Guggenheims had money industrial, undeniable, and growing. What they did not yet have, at least not in full measure, was the kind of social weight that turned wealth into legacy. In New York, where the rules of arrival were unwritten but ruthlessly enforced, a fortune alone was not enough. You needed a house. Not merely a residence, but a statement, a limestone or marble proof visible from the street, that your wealth was not a fluke or a windfall but a permanent condition. The great mansions of Fifth Avenue and the surrounding blocks were not simply homes. They were billboards, designed to communicate taste, stability, and belonging to a world that guarded its borders carefully. A ballroom said you entertained. A picture gallery said you collected. A staff of 20 said you could afford not to think about the price of coal or linens, or the quiet army required to keep the chandeliers polished and the silver gleaming. The Guggenheims understood the assignment. Daniel Guggenheim built on East 72nd Street. Solomon, the art collector, eventually settled into a townhouse on East 68th. Marie, Simon, and Benjamin each claimed their own addresses, smaller palaces that signaled both individuality and clan solidarity. These were not the largest houses in the city, the Vanderbilts still held that crown, but they were substantial, staffed, and designed to impress. They opened their doors for dinners and musicales and charity events, the carefully choreographed rituals that maintained social position. Because in this world, visibility was currency. You were seen at the opera, at the right galas, in the society pages with the right people. You married well, preferably to old money, or at least to money that had learned to act old. You patronized the arts. You gave to hospitals and universities, not quietly, but with your name in bronze on the facade. Philanthropy was both genuine and strategic, a way to soften the rough edges of an industrial fortune, to prove that the men who ran smelters could also endow museums and appreciate beauty. Among the Guggenheim brothers, two figures would come to define very different paths forward, and both would shape the story of Falaise, directly or by shadow. Solomon Robert Guggenheim, born in 1861, was the aesthete. Reserved, cerebral, and increasingly drawn to art, he had worked in the family business but never with the ferocity of Daniel. By middle age, Solomon had begun to step back from mining and metals, turning instead toward collecting. He bought old masters at first, then, under the influence of the artist Hilaire, pivoted to modern abstraction Kandinsky, Klee, Bauer. It was a controversial choice in the 1930s, when most serious collectors still prized European realism. But Solomon was building something larger than a personal gallery. He was building an institution. In 1939, he would open the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, the seed of what became the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, Frank Lloyd Wright's spiraling masterpiece on Fifth Avenue. Solomon's legacy would be cultural, cerebral, attached to ideas rather than industries. Harry Frank Guggenheim, Solomon's nephew, born in 1890, was a different creature entirely. The son of Daniel, Harry inherited not only wealth, but the expectation of leadership. He was restless, competitive, and intensely physical, a man who flew planes, raised horses, and moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and rarely needed to ask twice. Harry was a decorated combat pilot in the First World War, a businessman, a diplomat who served as ambassador to Cuba, and eventually a publisher. He was also the man who would build Falaise and whose personal tragedies would come to embody the so-called Guggenheim curse. The two men, Solomon the patron, Harry the adventurer, represented different answers to the same question. What does the second generation do with a fortune it did not have to build? For some, the answer was art and philanthropy. For others, it was motion, risk, the construction of a life large enough to justify the inheritance. But all of it, the mansions, the collections, the philanthropy, the carefully curated public lives required relentless cash flow. Gilded Age elegance was expensive not once, but continuously. A Fifth Avenue townhouse needed heat, staff, maintenance, taxes. The carriages became motor cars, which required chauffeurs and garages. Fashion changed. Furnishings had to be updated. Dinner for 30 required a kitchen staff that could execute flawlessly. Footmen who could serve without a misstep. Florists and wine merchants and all the invisible infrastructure that made wealth look effortless. The paradox was this: the more secure you appeared, the more you had to spend to maintain the illusion. A house in disrepair suggested financial trouble. Staff reductions suggested decline. To stop entertaining was to admit you could no longer afford to, and in a world where perception shaped reality, that admission was fatal. And so the Guggenheims, like their peers, spent. They built, collected, entertained, donated. They performed wealth as a kind of theater because in their world, the performance was the point. The machinery that produced the fortune, the mines, the smelters, the commodity markets ran in the background, largely out of sight. What the public saw was marble and silk, art and philanthropy, elegance so polished it seemed to require no effort at all. But every mansion was a hungry thing, and every family, no matter how gilded, had to keep feeding it or watch it fall. The great townhouses still stood, still functioned as winter headquarters and social command centers, but the families who owned them had begun to hunger for something the city could not provide: distance. Not just from the noise and crowds in summer heat, but from proximity itself, the claustrophobic press of neighbors, the lack of horizon, the inability to move through your own property without encountering a street, a sidewalk, someone else's wall. In Manhattan, wealth bought you a larger cage. On Long Island's North Shore, it bought you the illusion of empire. The Gold Coast, as it came to be known, stretched along the Sound from Great Neck to Oyster Bay and beyond. A string of estates so dense with old names and new money that the area functioned as a kind of American aristocratic theme park. The Whitneys were there, the Phippses, the Pratts, the Guests, the Morgans. F. Vaughan. Scott Fitzgerald set The Great Gatsby in the shadow of these estates, and while his fiction sharpened the edges, the underlying truth was accurate. This was a landscape built by people who had already won or believed they had, and who wanted their winnings displayed in acreage, architecture, and the kind of controlled beauty that required an army to maintain. Sands Point, jutting into Long Island Sound like a granite finger, was among the most desirable enclaves. The land was hilly, wooded, and edged with bluffs that dropped to private beaches. The views stretched across open water. The air smelled of salt and cut grass rather than coal smoke and asphalt. And perhaps most importantly, the lots were large 10 acres, 20, 50, sometimes more. You could build a house and never see your neighbor's roofline. You could plant gardens that took 20 minutes to walk through. You could stable horses, garage a fleet of motor cars, house your staff in quarters far enough from the main residence that their lives remained invisible unless summoned. This was what land bought in the 1920s. Not just beauty, but control. Control over sightlines, over who could approach and when, over the boundary between public performance and private life. In the city, reporters could loiter outside your door. At Sands Point, they needed an invitation to pass the gate. Harry Guggenheim understood this. By the mid-1920s, he was in his 30s, recently married to his second wife, and flush with both inherited wealth and his own earnings from business ventures and diplomatic service. He had flown combat missions over France, had served as an envoy to Cuba, and had cultivated a public image as a man of action, physical, patriotic, unafraid of risk. He needed a house that matched that image, and Fifth Avenue townhouses, no matter how elegantly furnished, felt too small, too tame, too hemmed in by convention. In 1923, Harry purchased 90 acres at Sands Point. The site was extraordinary, a high bluff overlooking the Sound with open water to the north and wooded privacy to the south. It was close enough to Manhattan for weekend entertaining 40 minutes by motor car when the roads were clear, but far enough to feel like a true escape, a world apart from the pressures of business and society. What he built there would be called Falaise, and it would become the physical anchor not just of his own life, but of a family narrative that blurred romance and tragedy in ways Harry could not have predicted. But before the house, before the interiors and the collections and the parties, came the infrastructure, the hidden, relentless machinery that turned raw land into a functioning estate. Because an estate of this scale was not a house with a yard. It was an organism, complex and meaty, that required constant feeding. The shoreline had to be managed, sea walls to prevent erosion, steps cut into the bluff for beach access, docks for boats. Roads had to be graded and paved, wide enough for motor cars and delivery trucks, smooth enough that guests arrived without dust or jarring. Utilities had to be extended or generated, water lines, electrical service, telephone cables. A greenhouse was essential for year-round flowers and out-of-season produce. Stables housed the horses. Garages sheltered the motor cars' multiple bays because no one at this level owned just one vehicle. Staff quarters had to be built. Rooms for the chauffeurs, the gardeners, the kitchen staff, the maids, the butler, the housekeeper. Some lived on-site full-time. Others commuted from nearby villages, but all required space, supervision, and wages. And then there were the gardens. Not the casual plantings of a suburban yard, but formal landscapes designed by professionals. Parterres, terraces, specimen trees, walking paths that guided visitors through carefully composed views. These required not one gardener but a team, working year-round to prune, plant, mulch, and maintain the illusion that such beauty was natural rather than relentlessly constructed. The paradox was everywhere. Estates like this were sold as retreat places to escape the demands of the city, to find peace and simplicity in nature. But there was nothing simple about them. They demanded industrial-scale logistics. A weekend house party for 20 guests required a staff of 30 to execute cooking, serving, cleaning, chauffeuring, tending fires, turning down beds, pressing clothes, polishing silver. If the family was not in residence, a skeleton crew still had to remain. Someone to heat the pipes in winter, to air the rooms, to patrol the grounds, to ensure the house did not slide into the kind of neglect that, once begun, was nearly impossible to reverse. Pastoral calm, it turned out, was an expensive performance. The view from the terrace, open water, green lawn, perfect stillness was made possible by constant, invisible labor. The silence was not the absence of work, but the successful concealment of it. Harry Guggenheim bought Sands Point to build a legacy, a physical manifestation of success and taste that would endure long after the mines and smelters were forgotten. What he could not yet see was that the estate itself, beautiful and commanding as it would become, carried its own costs, financial, emotional, and eventually existential. Every mansion is a promise, but it is also a debt, and the bill comes due whether you are ready or not. Every great house begins twice. First as an idea, a feeling the client cannot quite articulate but insists the architect must understand, and then again as drawings, contracts, and the slow, expensive translation of vision into physical fact. For Harry Guggenheim, the idea was rootedness. He wanted a house that looked as though it had stood for centuries, as though his family had occupied this bluff since the Norman conquest rather than having purchased it with copper money 3 years earlier. The aesthetic he sought was not American colonial, not French Renaissance, not the kind of Beaux-Arts grandeur his uncles favored in the city. He wanted something older, rougher, more European, a house that suggested continuity, permanence, and a taste refined enough to reject obvious opulence in favor of something more authentic. The result would be a fantasy, but a disciplined one. Harry hired Frederick J. Sterner, a society architect known for his ability to blend historical styles with modern comfort, and later worked closely with Polhemus and Coffin, a firm experienced in the demands of Gold Coast estates. The directive was clear: design a house that evokes a Norman manor, something that might overlook the cliffs of Normandy or the English Channel, but engineer it to function flawlessly for a 20th century American family that expected hot water, electric lights, and telephones without the inconvenience of visible modernity. The design that emerged was compact by Gold Coast standards, no sprawling wings, no ballroom for 200, but meticulously detailed. The exterior was Indiana limestone and stucco, chosen for its ability to weather gracefully and to echo the pale stone of medieval France. The roof lines were steeply pitched, punctuated by chimneys and a small tower that gave the house a vertical emphasis, a silhouette that read as old even when brand new. Windows were leaded glass, some with iron casements that swung outward in the European manner. Entry was through a cobblestoned courtyard, enclosed on 3 sides, so that visitors arrived not into open space, but into a composed, sheltered world that felt both intimate and deliberately staged. Inside, the rooms were arranged with a logic that balanced grandeur and livability. A great hall served as the social heart, its walls paneled in dark wood, its ceiling beamed, its fireplace large enough to heat the space and serve as theater. Adjacent were a dining room, a library, a morning room, each carefully proportioned, each furnished with antiques or reproductions selected to reinforce the medieval mood. Upstairs, bedrooms for family and guests, bathrooms that concealed all modern plumbing behind period-appropriate fixtures and tile. But the romance was only half the story. Beneath and behind the visible house ran the hidden infrastructure that made it habitable. The foundation had to be engineered to anchor the structure into the bluff, accounting for soil composition, drainage, and the freeze-thaw cycles of Long Island winters. Drainage systems carried water away from the house to prevent flooding and foundation erosion, critical on a site where storms could push wind and rain horizontally off the Sound. The basement housed the furnace, a coal-burning leviathan that fed hot water through radiators in every room, along with storage for fuel, wine, and household supplies. Electrical wiring was threaded through walls designed to look pre-industrial, concealed so thoroughly that no switch plate or outlet disrupted the aesthetic. Telephone lines were run discreetly. The kitchen, located in the service wing, was outfitted with commercial-grade equipment, massive stoves, iceboxes that would soon become refrigerators, sinks deep enough for roasting pans, work tables for a staff that might prepare dinners for 30. Service corridors allowed staff to move between kitchen, dining room, and bedrooms without being seen by family or guests, a spatial segregation fundamental to estates of this class. Heating a house like this, especially one perched on a bluff exposed to winter wind and salt air, was an engineering challenge that never ended. Coal had to be delivered by the ton, shoveled into the furnace, its ash removed. Radiators required maintenance. Pipes could freeze if the system failed. In summer, there was no air conditioning, only open windows and the hope of a breeze, which meant salt air infiltrated every surface, corroding metal, fading fabric, leaving a fine saline residue that had to be wiped away constantly. The landscaping, overseen by the Olmsted Brothers firm, extended the house's logic outward. Terraced gardens, stone walls, specimen plantings chosen to evoke an English countryside transported to Long Island. Paths were graded and graveled. A pergola provided shaded seating with views of the Sound. Every tree, every hedge, every flower bed was placed with intention, and every one required care. Harry famously collected art and objects to furnish the interiors: Spanish and Italian antiques, tapestries, wrought iron, carved wood. Some pieces were genuine medieval, others high-quality reproductions. The line between authentic and constructed blurred intentionally. The goal was not a museum, but a home that felt layered with history, as though generations had lived here and left their mark. Construction took nearly 3 years. The costs, though not fully documented in surviving records, were substantial, likely several $100,000, equivalent to many millions today. But that figure, impressive as it was, represented only the down payment. The real expense of a house like Falaise was not in the building, but in the keeping. Salt air corroded metal and damaged masonry. Paint peeled. Wood swelled and contracted. Roofs needed inspection after every major storm. Gardens required year-round staff. Heating, staffing, insurance, taxes, all of it continued, whether the family was in residence 1 month a year or 12. A mansion is not a possession that you buy and forget. It is a responsibility that never sleeps, a machine that consumes money, labor, and attention in perpetuity. Harry moved into Falaise in 1926, and for a time, the house fulfilled its promise. It was beautiful. It was admired. It looked, as he had hoped, like it had always been there. But permanence, it turns out, is not a quality you can build into stone. It is something you have to pay for over and over long after the architects and craftsmen have gone home. The guests who arrived at Falaise for a weekend in 1928 saw a house that seemed to run itself, fires already lit, beds turned down with fresh linens, flowers arranged in every room, dinner served at 8 with silent precision, courses emerging from the kitchen as though conjured by wish rather than work. What they did not see, because the architecture was designed to prevent it, was the small village of uniformed workers who made that illusion possible. Running an estate like Falaise required a staff of 20 to 30 people, the exact number fluctuating with the season and the family's social calendar. At the top of the hierarchy stood the butler, a man whose authority over the household was absolute below the family itself. He managed the front-of-house staff, oversaw service at meals, maintained the wine cellar, and ensured that every visible detail met standards that allowed no compromise. Beneath him, footmen, whose duties ranged from answering doors to serving at table to polishing silver until it reflected like a mirror. The housekeeper, typically a woman of middle age with decades of experience, commanded the female staff. She supervised chambermaids who cleaned bedrooms, changed linens, dusted furniture, and maintained the kind of order that required every object to be returned to its exact position after cleaning. Laundresses worked in dedicated rooms, washing, starching, ironing linens for the table, bedding for a dozen rooms, the family's clothing, uniforms for the staff themselves. A formal dinner for 20 could generate tablecloths, napkins, and underlinings that required hours to press correctly. In the kitchen, a cook presided, often trained in French techniques or experienced in the specific demands of American high society entertaining. She might have 1 or 2 kitchen maids assisting, chopping, stirring, washing the mountains of pots and pans that a multi-course dinner required. Menus were planned days in advance, provisions ordered from specialized vendors in the city or local purveyors who understood that quality was non-negotiable and delays unacceptable. Outside, the estate required its own workforce. A head gardener managed a team of under-gardeners, men who mowed, pruned, planted, mulched, and operated the greenhouse that supplied flowers and out-of-season vegetables. Chauffeurs maintained the motor cars, a job that meant not only driving but mechanical knowledge, polishing chrome and leather, ensuring vehicles were fueled and ready at a moment's notice. If the family kept horses, stable hands fed, groomed, exercised, and mucked stalls daily, work that was physically demanding and unrelenting regardless of weather. A maintenance man, sometimes more than one, handled repairs, plumbing leaks, electrical issues, broken windows, stuck doors, roof inspections after storms. In winter, someone had to tend the coal furnace around the clock, shoveling fuel, removing ash, monitoring temperatures to ensure pipes did not freeze and rooms remained habitable. The choreography of a weekend house party revealed the system at full operation. Guests arrived Friday evening. Chauffeurs met them at the train station or ferried them from the city. Footmen carried luggage upstairs via back staircases the guests never saw. Maids unpacked suitcases, pressed wrinkled garments, drew baths. Downstairs, the cook and her team prepared a late supper. The butler decanted wine, arranged the dining room, briefed the footmen on service. Saturday brought breakfast in the morning room, luncheon on the terrace if weather permitted, perhaps activities, tennis, sailing, riding that required staff to prepare equipment, pack picnics, clean up afterward. Afternoon tea involved cakes and sandwiches that appeared, again as if by magic. Dinner was the evening's centerpiece, multiple courses, wine pairings, table settings that required the correct crystal, china, and flatware for each stage of the meal. After dinner, staff cleared, washed, and reset. Bedrooms were turned down, fires refreshed. The house made ready for the night. Sunday repeated the pattern, culminating in departures that required the same coordination in reverse. Luggage repacked, cars ready, thank you notes from the hostess already written. Through all of this, staff moved through a parallel architecture. Back staircases connected floors without entering family hallways. Service corridors linked kitchen to dining room, unseen. Staff ate in their own dining hall, slept in attic or wing bedrooms that were smaller, plainer, less heated. The spatial segregation was not incidental but designed. The family's experience of the house depended on never encountering the labor that sustained it. Wages varied by position and skill. A butler might earn $75 to $100 per month, a substantial sum for the era, plus room and board. Maids and footmen earn less $30 to $50, but for many, especially immigrants or young workers from rural areas, the stability and respectability of employment in a great house outweighed the modest pay. Hierarchy was strict, promotion was possible but slow. Turnover could be high in lower positions, but senior staff often remained for years, even decades, developing pride in their mastery of standards most people never imagined existed. There was dignity in this work, though it is easy for later generations to see only servitude. A table set perfectly, a room clean to invisibility, a dinner served without a single misstep. These were accomplishments that required skill, discipline, and an attention to detail that many staff took seriously. They enabled a life they would never live themselves, but they were also, in their way, craftsmen. The contrast was inescapable. Front-of-house glamour required back-of-house exhaustion. Effortless entertaining was the result of ruthlessly disciplined labor. The house looked serene because someone, somewhere out of sight, was working. There are families whose tragedies remain private, absorbed quietly into the ordinary sorrow of human life. And then there are families whose losses become public spectacle, catalogued by newspapers, whispered about in drawing rooms, and eventually hardened into myth. The Guggenheims were the latter. The word curse is theatrical, the kind of language gossip columns love and historians mistrust. But by the middle of the 20th century, even sober observers had begun to notice a pattern. The family that had built museums and mansions, that had turned copper into culture, seemed to attract tragedy with a frequency that felt less like coincidence than design. Sudden deaths, accidents, suicides, divorces that shattered fortunes and reputations. The losses were real, the grief genuine, but because the name was famous and the wealth extraordinary, private pain became public entertainment. It began, as these stories often do, with the most famous death of the early 20th century. On the night of April 14, 1912, Benjamin Guggenheim, youngest of Meyer's sons, a man known more for his charm and his complicated personal life than for business acumen, was traveling aboard the RMS Titanic en route from Europe to New York. He was not alone. His mistress, a French singer, was with him, a detail the press would not miss. When the ship struck the iceberg and began its slow, terrible descent, Benjamin reportedly helped women and children into lifeboats, then retreated to his stateroom with his valet. According to survivor testimony, he changed into evening clothes, emerged onto the slanting deck, and said he was prepared to go down like a gentleman. Whether the story is fully accurate or partly embellished by traumatized witnesses hardly matters. Benjamin died that night in the cold Atlantic, and his death, draped in the twin myths of heroism and scandal, became the first chapter in the narrative of the Guggenheim curse. His widow, Florette, was left with 3 daughters and an estate complicated by Benjamin's extramarital entanglements. The grief was private, but the settlement was not. Newspapers covered it. Society whispered. The family absorbed the loss and continued, because that was what families of this stature did. They mourned behind closed doors and maintained appearances in public. But Benjamin's death was only the beginning. In 1922, William Guggenheim Jr., son of one of the brothers, died suddenly. In 1939, Solomon's brother-in-law died by suicide. The details varied, but the drumbeat of loss continued across the decades. Then came the tragedies closest to Falaise itself. Harry Guggenheim's personal life became a catalogue of fractures. His first marriage to Helen Rosenberg ended in divorce. His second marriage, to Caroline Morton called Caro, began with promise but grew strained under the pressures of wealth, public life, and Harry's relentless ambition. In 1963, their daughter Diane, only a child when her parents divorced, died in her early 20s under circumstances the family did not discuss publicly. Later, Harry's third wife, Alicia Patterson, a brilliant newspaper publisher and the great love of his later life, died suddenly of a bleeding ulcer in 1963. Harry was in his 70s, and the loss shattered him in ways even his wartime service had not. Each death brought not just grief, but logistical upheaval. Estates had to be settled, wills probated, properties reassigned, inheritance taxes calculated and paid. When the wealthy die, the machinery of asset distribution begins immediately, even as the family is still reeling. Lawyers arrive. Accountants appear. Documents require signatures. The house, meanwhile, continues to require heat, staff, maintenance. Grief does not pause the invoices. Inside great houses, mourning took on its own rituals. Rooms might be closed, their furnishings draped. Portraits were hung or moved to honor the dead. Memorial services were held, often followed by philanthropic gestures, an endowment, a wing of a hospital, a scholarship fund that transformed private loss into public legacy. These gestures were genuine, but they also served a function. They reasserted the family's place in society, reminded the world that Guggenheim's contributed, mattered, endured. But endurance had a cost. Relationships strained under the weight of repeated tragedy. Some family members withdrew, preferring privacy to the relentless scrutiny that came with the name. Others doubled down, working harder, building more, as though motion could outrun sorrow. Harry fell into the latter category. After each loss, he returned to work publishing, diplomacy, horse breeding, aviation advocacy. Falaise remained his anchor, the one constant in a life marked by turbulence. The public, meanwhile, fed on the narrative. Newspapers ran retrospectives, the Guggenheim curse strikes again. Biographers speculated. Society columnists whispered that perhaps all that wealth came at a price, that fortunes built on extraction and industry carried some metaphysical debt. The family, for the most part, refused to engage with the mythology. They did not believe in curses. They believed in bad luck, in the statistical reality that large families across many decades will experience tragedy, and in the fact that wealth does not insulate anyone from death. But belief is less powerful than repetition. The more the story was told, the more it calcified into truth. The Guggenheims were cursed not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the narrative was irresistible. And so the family carried two burdens, the real grief of loss and the public myth that their suffering was somehow preordained. A cautionary tale for anyone who dared to rise too high or reach too far. By the 1930s, some members of the Guggenheim family had begun to ask a question that haunts every great fortune built on extraction and industry: what remains when the mines run dry? When the smelters close? When the commodities that built the empire are forgotten? The answer, for a few of them, was art. Solomon Robert Guggenheim had spent his middle years dutifully working in the family business: mining, smelting, the administration of global operations that generated millions. But by his 60s, he had grown restless with balance sheets and commodity markets. He wanted something that engaged not his calculating mind but his soul, or at least the part of him that believed wealth should serve purposes larger than reproduction of itself. Collecting art became that purpose. Solomon began conservatively, as most collectors of his generation did. Old masters, European realism, the kind of paintings that signaled taste and education. But in the late 1920s, he met Hilla Ribe, a German painter and passionate advocate for non-objective art abstraction, the radical belief that painting need not represent anything recognizable to be profound. Ribe was persuasive, visionary, and uncompromising. Under her influence, Solomon's collection pivoted dramatically. Out went the traditional landscapes and portraits. In came Kandinsky, Klee, Delaunay, ledger artists, whose work baffled much of the American public but whom Ribe insisted were the future. Solomon did not merely collect, He built an institution. In 1937, he established the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. 2 years later, he opened the Museum of Non-Objective Painting in rented quarters on East 54th Street in Manhattan. It was small, eccentric, criticized by traditional critics, but it was his. And in 1943, he commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to design a permanent home for the collection, a building that would become as famous as the art it housed. The spiraling, white rotunda on Fifth Avenue that opened in 1959, 6 months after Solomon's death. The museum was a triumph, a way to convert industrial money, tainted by association with labor disputes and monopoly, into something the public could admire without reservation. It was philanthropy, yes, but also strategy. A museum carried the family name into the future, attached it to beauty and intellect rather than smelters and ore. It created a legacy that did not require heirs to manage mines or navigate volatile markets. The art, carefully maintained and publicly accessible, would endure. But museums, once created, become their own kind of burden. They require endowments to fund operations, boards to govern them, curators to make acquisitions and plan exhibitions, buildings to maintain and Wright's masterpiece, stunning as it was, presented chronic challenges with lighting, climate control, and the practicalities of displaying art on curved walls. What began as a private passion became a public trust, with all the obligations, scrutiny, and politics that entailed. Solomon had wanted permanence. What he also got was perpetual responsibility. Across the Atlantic, another Guggenheim was building a very different kind of legacy. Peggy Guggenheim, daughter of the ill-fated Benjamin, had grown up wealthy but restless, never quite fitting the mold of respectable American society. She fled to Europe in the 1920s, immersed herself in the avant-garde art world of Paris and London, and began collecting with a passion that was personal, instinctive, and often scandalous by her family standards. She championed surrealists and abstract expressionists, supported struggling artists, lived openly with lovers, and cultivated a persona that oscillated between patron and provocateur. In 1949, Peggy opened her own museum in Venice, housed in the Palazzo Venia dei Leoni on the Grand Canal. Her collection, Pollock, Rothko, Moreau, Ernst, was wildly different in taste from Solomon's, but equally serious in intent. Peggy's museum was smaller, more intimate, more eccentric. It reflected her life, bohemian, cosmopolitan, unapologetically individual. Where Solomon's Guggenheim Museum sought to educate the American public in the language of high modernism, Peggy's offered a more personal encounter, a collection shaped by passion rather than committee. The two museums' uncles and nieces stood as counterpoints. One was institutional, monumental, designed to anchor the family name in American cultural life. The other was idiosyncratic, European, a gesture of defiance as much as legacy. Both, however, were answers to the same underlying question. How do you make wealth mean something beyond itself? Art offered one solution. Unlike industrial assets, which could be liquidated or rendered obsolete, great art appreciated. It carried cultural capital that money alone could not buy. It allowed families like the Guggenheims to be remembered not for labor disputes in Arizona copper mines, but for Kandinsky and Pollock, for spiraling galleries and Venetian palaces. But the transformation was never complete. Museums required constant funding. Boards argued over acquisitions and direction. The public, granted access to collections, also gained the right to critique and question. Philanthropy, it turned out, was not a simple gift, but an exchange generosity traded for a measure of control, for the right to shape how the family would be remembered. Solomon and Peggy both understood, in their different ways, that art was not an escape from the burdens of wealth, but a transmutation of them. The fortune remained restless, demanding, hungry for purpose. They had simply redirected its appetite from ore to oil paint, from profit margins to posterity. There is a particular kind of financial vulnerability that comes with being rich in the wrong things at the wrong time. The Guggenheim name still carried weight in the 1930s. It opened boardroom doors, commanded respect in philanthropy circles, and guaranteed a certain social standing. But names, however illustrious, do not pay property taxes. They do not cover the coal bill when winter winds off Long Island Sound drive heating costs into the thousands. They do not negotiate with the gardeners' union or persuade insurance companies to lower premiums on a property perpetually exposed to salt air and storm damage. The Great Depression reshuffled American wealth with a brutality that did not distinguish between new money and old. The stock market crash of 1929 evaporated paper fortunes overnight. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Even families with diversified holdings, mining interests, real estate, corporate stock watched their net worth contract with sickening speed. The Guggenheims were better insulated than most. The foundation of their fortune was industrial rather than speculative, and they had spread risk across continents and commodities. But insulation is not immunity. Revenue streams that had seemed inexhaustible slowed. Dividends shrank. Investments that had been counted on to fund operations and lifestyles suddenly required patience or worse, liquidation at unfavorable prices. And all the while, the estate's fillets among them continued to demand the same relentless expenditure they always had. Consider the arithmetic of a single year at fillets in the mid-1930s. Staff wages, even with cuts and layoffs, ran to tens of thousands of dollars annually. Heating the house through a Long Island winter consumed trainloads of coal, later converted to oil, each gallon a line item that accumulated into staggering totals. Property taxes, assessed on the land and the improvements, came due regardless of income. Insurance premiums covered fire, theft, liability, storm damage, all higher for a property of this size and exposure. Routine maintenance was constant: roof inspections, gutter cleaning, painting, masonry repair, chimney sweeping, furnace servicing, plumbing, electrical. Then came the gardens, labor, materials, greenhouse heating, specimen plants that required replacement when they failed. A weekend visit by the family cost hundreds of dollars to execute properly. Staff recalled from reduced schedules, provisions ordered, rooms opened and heated. An extended absence did not eliminate costs, only shifted them. Skeleton crews still patrolled, pipes still needed protection from freezing, and a house left unoccupied too long began the irreversible slide toward decay. The labor market, meanwhile, was transforming. Domestic service, once a respectable if modest career path for immigrants and rural workers, was losing its appeal. Younger generations sought factory work, office jobs, positions with weekends off, and the possibility of advancement. The Depression temporarily reversed this trend. Any job was better than none. But by the 1940s, the old model was dying. Wages had to rise to retain staff. Standards had to relax. Fewer people were willing to live in, to work the invisible hours, to maintain the rigid hierarchy that made great houses function. World War II accelerated everything. Labor shortages became acute as men enlisted or took war production jobs. Rationing constrained fuel, food, luxury goods. The social calendar that had once justified these estates evaporated. Entertaining on a grand scale felt tone-deaf, even unpatriotic, when the nation was mobilized for survival. Some estates were commandeered for military use or converted to hospitals. Others simply closed wings, covered furniture in dust sheets, and waited. Harry Guggenheim, who had served as a naval aviator in the First World War, threw himself into war-related work during the Second. Fillets became less a residence than a symbol, a place he returned to between obligations. The house endured, but its purpose had shifted. It was no longer the stage for the kind of life it had been designed to accommodate. By the 1950s, the cultural ground had shifted entirely. Formality was out, casual living was in. The new suburban model, smaller houses, minimal staff, family-centered rather than socially performative, was ascendant. Estate taxes, stiffened by mid-century reforms, took enormous bites out of inheritances, forcing heirs to liquidate properties just to pay the government. The Gold Coast began to empty. Estates were subdivided, sold to developers, donated to institutions, or simply abandoned and demolished. Fillets survived, but survival required choices. Deferred maintenance accumulated. Staff rosters shrank. Parcels of the original 90 acres were sold off. What had been built as a symbol of permanence was revealed, with each passing year, to be contingent, dependent on cash flow, on heirs willing to subsidize it, on a social world that no longer existed. The compounding was relentless. Tragedy had fractured the family. Time had shifted the culture. And now, economics finished what grief and changing tastes had begun. The curse, if there was one, was not supernatural. It was arithmetic. Fixed costs met declining liquidity. Tradition collided with a new world that did not care how beautiful your house was if you could not afford to keep it warm. One by one, the great estates fell. Mansions that had taken years to build were erased in weeks. Limestone facades reduced to rubble. Formal gardens plowed under for cul-de-sacs. Coastline, once private, opened to subdivisions with names like Harbor View Estates or Sound Shore Manor. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. Land was worth more empty than occupied. A single waterfront acre could be carved into 3 or 4 building lots, each sold for enough to make demolition not just viable but profitable. Developers circled like gulls, patient and opportunistic, waiting for the inevitable moment when heirs tired of tax bills and maintenance invoices. Falaise came perilously close. Harry Guggenheim had lived there, on and off, for nearly 4 decades. But by the late 1960s, he was in his 70s, twice widowed, spending more time at his horse farm in South Carolina than on Long Island. The house, magnificent as it remained, had become a weight. Staff had dwindled to a skeleton crew. Rooms were closed. The furnace still ran in winter, but only enough to prevent pipe bursts, not for comfort. The gardens, once meticulously maintained, had softened into something closer to managed neglect. Harry had no children who survived him. His daughter Diane was long dead. There were nieces and nephews, but none with the resources or inclination to take on a property that consumed 6 figures annually just to keep standing. The question was not whether Falaise would leave family hands, but how and whether anything of it would survive the transaction. The options were limited and none were appealing. A private sale would almost certainly mean demolition. No individual buyer wanted a Norman manor with 40 rooms and crumbling infrastructure. Subdivision was possible, but would destroy the estate's integrity, carving the bluff into parcels and erasing the unified vision Harry had built. Abandonment was unthinkable, but not impossible. Houses left empty deteriorate with shocking speed, especially near salt water. What saved Falaise was neither sentiment nor family loyalty, but a legal structure that turned private liability into public asset. In 1967, Harry began negotiations with Nassau County and the Long Island State Park Commission, exploring the possibility of donation. The concept was straightforward. The estate would pass to public stewardship, preserved as a museum and historic site, in exchange for tax relief and the assurance that it would endure. But straightforward in concept meant years of legal maneuvering in practice. Appraisals, environmental assessments, negotiations over which parcels would transfer and which could be sold to fund an endowment, decisions about what to preserve furniture, art, the archives, and what could be dispersed. The emotional texture of this transition is harder to document than the legal mechanics, but no less real. Staff who had worked at Falaise for decades were let go or reassigned. Rooms that had been lived in were staged as exhibitions. Objects that had been used dinner services, linens, personal belongings were cataloged, some kept, others auctioned to raise funds. The house began its transformation from home to artifact, a process that required everything to be seen differently, not as Harry's library, but as a historic interior. Not as the dining room, but as a period room illustrating Gold Coast life. Locks appeared on doors that had never needed them. Ropes cordoned off spaces once open. The informal privilege of wealth moving through your own house without restriction gave way to the bureaucratic logic of preservation, controlled access, scheduled tours, conservation priorities. Harry Guggenheim died in 1971. By then, the transfer was nearly complete. Falaise, along with a reduced but still significant portion of the original acreage, passed to Nassau County. It opened to the public in 1973, operated under the auspices of the Nassau County Museum of Art. What had been saved was substantial: the house, its major furnishings, the core of the landscape, and the possibility that future generations could encounter, even briefly, what life had looked like at this altitude of American wealth. But what had been lost was also real. The estate as a living organism, staff, seasonal rhythms, the particular atmosphere of a house occupied rather than observed, was gone. Preservation is not resurrection. It is a kind of controlled death, a decision to freeze rather than demolish, to interpret rather than inhabit. The family had owned Falaise outright, answered to no one, could close it or open it at will. The public now held it in trust, subject to budgets, governance, and the expectations of taxpayers who funded its operation. Inheritance had been a privilege. It became, in the end, a liability so profound that only by giving it away could the family ensure it would survive at all. The house is open on Wednesdays and Sundays, April through October, weather permitting. Admission is $12. Tours are guided, limited to 15 people, and last approximately 45 minutes. Photography is allowed, but no flash. Do not touch the furnishings. This is Falaise now, not a home, but a managed historical artifact, its survival dependent on an entirely different kind of machinery than the one that ran it in Harry Guggenheim's time. Operating a historic house museum is an exercise in perpetual triage. The building is nearly a century old. perched on a bluff where salt air corrodes metal, swells wood, and infiltrates masonry with patient, relentless chemistry. Every winter freeze-thaw cycle shifts foundations imperceptibly. Every storm tests the roof, the gutters, the drainage systems that keep water from undermining the structure. Left alone, the house would begin to fail within months. Preservation is not a one-time effort, but a continuous, expensive negotiation with entropy. The staff is small, nothing like the small village that once kept the estate functioning, but each role is critical. A curator oversees the collection furniture, textiles, decorative objects, archives managing environmental conditions, monitoring for pests and mold, rotating displayed items to minimize light damage. Grounds crews mow, prune, and manage the landscape, now simplified from its original complexity but still substantial. Administrative staff handle scheduling, fundraising, grant applications, budgets, and the endless compliance requirements that come with operating a public site on county-owned land. Docents, many of them volunteers, are trained to guide tours, to translate the house's history for visitors whose understanding of estate life may range from deep to non-existent. Security monitors access, ensuring no one strays into restricted areas or handles objects that cannot withstand the oils and pressures of human touch. Tradespeople, electricians, plumbers, roofers, masons are called in constantly, addressing issues that reveal themselves in the ordinary operation of an aging building. The budget is a puzzle with no perfect solution. Admission fees and membership dues cover a fraction of operating costs. Grants from historical preservation organizations provide critical but unpredictable support. Even rentals, weddings, corporate gatherings, private functions held on the grounds or in certain rooms generate substantial revenue but also introduce stress. Every event means foot traffic, displaced furniture, the risk of spills or damage, the need for setup and breakdown that pull staff away from other work. Restoration projects are prioritized ruthlessly. The roof is not debatable. Water infiltration destroys everything below it, so roof repairs come first. Masonry stabilization is next. Stone that shifts or cracks threatens structural integrity. Climate control is a constant battle. The house was built without air conditioning, and retrofitting HVAC systems into historic fabric without compromising aesthetics or damaging original materials requires engineering finesse and significant expense. Fire suppression systems required by code for public occupancy must be installed discreetly. Accessibility upgrades, ramps, railings, restroom modifications are legally mandated but challenging in a building designed around staircases and narrow service corridors. Salt air accelerates everything. Metal corrodes faster. Paint degrades. Exterior wood requires more frequent refinishing. Stone absorbs moisture, then freezes, then cracks. Gardens planted in Harry's era have aged. Trees have grown large, their roots threatening foundations and utilities. Some must be removed, a decision that balances historical fidelity against structural safety. And through all of this, the house is open to the public. Visitors walk through rooms once private, stand on terraces where Harry entertained ambassadors and aviators, peer into closets and kitchens and service spaces that were designed never to be seen. The access is extraordinary, an opportunity to encounter, intimately, how extraordinary wealth once lived. But access is also risk. Every visitor is a potential source of damage, however unintentional. Nostalgia imagines these places as frozen in amber, perfectly preserved snapshots of a vanished world. The operational reality is far less romantic. Falaise endures not because it is timeless, but because a small, underfunded team works constantly to delay its inevitable decline. Preservation is not restoration to some pristine original state. It is managed deterioration, the art of slowing decay to a pace that allows the house to remain standing, accessible, and coherent for another season, another decade, another generation. The question, framed that way, misses the point. Curses are stories we tell when pattern and tragedy intersect in ways that feel too deliberate for coincidence, too dramatic for ordinary explanation. The Guggenheims experienced real loss, sudden death, fractured marriages, children who did not survive their parents, grief compounded by public scrutiny. Whether you call that a curse or simply the arithmetic of a large, visible family living across volatile decades matters less than what the pattern reveals. Wealth magnifies. It magnifies possibility, the ability to build museums, commission masterpieces, create beauty that endures. But it also magnifies vulnerability. When you own a mansion, its decline becomes public. When you bear a famous name, your tragedies become headlines. The same visibility that opens doors also removes the shelter of anonymity. You cannot mourn quietly when reporters are watching. You cannot fail privately when your house is a landmark. Falaise stands as proof of all of this. It was built with industrial money copper extracted from the earth by men whose labor Harry Guggenheim never saw, refined in smelters he never visited, converted into capital that allowed him to hire architects and craftsmen and landscape designers who translated his vision into stone and wood and glass. The house was meant to signal permanence, taste, and control, and for a time it succeeded, but every grand room depended on unseen labor. Every elegant dinner required a kitchen staff working in heat and chaos. Every perfectly maintained garden demanded year-round crews. The beauty was real, but so was the cost: financial, logistical, human. The house consumed resources relentlessly, and when the fortune that built it began to splinter, when heirs were gone or uninterested, when the culture shifted and domestic staffs became impossible to sustain, the choice became brutally clear: let it fall or give it away. Preservation saved Falaise, but preservation is not magic. It is work, it is budgets and grant writing and roof repairs and the constant triage of what can wait and what cannot. It is a small, dedicated staff doing work most visitors never see, ensuring that when you walk through those rooms, the experience feels seamless, almost effortless, just as it did when the Guggenheims lived there. The curse, if we insist on the word, was not metaphysical, it was structural. Great houses are beautiful, but they are also burdens. They require endless cash flow, endless attention, endless compromise between what was and what can be sustained. They survive not because they are timeless, but because someone, often many summons across generations, chose to carry the weight. Falaise is open to visitors. You can walk the rooms Harry designed. Stand on the terrace where he looked out over Long Island Sound. See the furnishings he selected and the art he collected. It is worth seeing. Not as fantasy, not as a monument to wealth, but as history, complicated, fragile, and sustained only by the willingness of people to care for it. These houses are not forever. They are only as permanent as our commitment to keeping them standing. Visit. Support your local preservation societies. Understand that what looks effortless is anything but.